Hi everyone, my name is Cassandra Tootin and I'm the Special Projects Coordinator here at the Rosalynn Carter Institute for Caregiving in Americus, Georgia, and I'd like to welcome everyone to the Assessing Caregiver Burden webinar. But before we begin, I'd like to welcome our presenter today, Gayle Alston. Gayle began her work at the Rosalynn Carter Institute in 2007 as the Director of the Caregiver Support Program serving the local community. In 2008, she stepped into the position of Director of Community Initiatives, where she provided leadership and technical assistance for implementing evidence-based caregiver programs around the state of Georgia. In early 2013, Gayle became the first director of the RCI Training Center for Excellence, providing training, certification, and technical assistance for a menu of evidence-based caregiver support programs around the nation. Currently, Gayle is leading the Dealing with Dementia project, providing RCI's newly created comprehensive reference guide to dementia family and professional caregivers around the state of Georgia. At this time, I'd like to turn it over to Gayle. Gayle?
Thanks, Cassandra. And greetings, everyone, from the Rosalynn Carter Institute for Caregiving. As you know, I'm Gayle Alston, and I'll be sharing information with you about caregiver burden and how to use two assessment instruments to identify caregivers who may be at risk for high burden and even caregiver burnout. First, I want to briefly discuss why caregivers are important to our work in the aging services world. Although residential facilities are home to many people who are requiring care for chronic illness or disability, the fact is that 90% of those who need ongoing care and supervision are residing within the community and being cared for by family caregivers. This care provided by families actually adds up to $7 billion, that's billion with a B, dollars a year just in the state of Georgia. As we've seen funding for services reduced over the years, it is clear that without the support of family caregivers, the situation would be beyond tragic and put most of our aging and disabled populations in serious danger. Now, caring for a family member is most often a positive experience. Caregivers state that they are thankful for the extra time they have with a loved one. They get a feeling of fulfillment when they can return the love and care to a parent or a spouse who's been there for them during their lives. Often caregivers gain in self-esteem as they learn new skills and become an authority on navigating a very complex healthcare system. However, caregiving is also stressful. First, as you can imagine, it's very upsetting to watch someone you care about struggle with an illness or decline due to aging or dementia. Also, anticipating and meeting the needs of an adult who is incapacitated can be extremely time-consuming and difficult. There are always important decisions to make, and sometimes those decisions have to be made in a crisis situation without the information you truly need to feel confident about the decision you're making. As caregiving responsibilities take priority, the caregiver discontinues the activities that give them a good quality of life, such as time with friends, hobbies, education, even exercise. By now, most people are aware that constant stress can affect their mental and physical well-being. However, they may not recognize the symptoms of ongoing stress. If you look at this chart, you'll see that the symptoms of stress show up in all four areas of your life, in your body, in your mind, in your emotions, and in your behaviors. Now, each of these symptoms could result from other causes, but if someone recognizes several of these symptoms on the chart, they should consider stress as being the culprit. As you read this chart, if you say, heck, that's just describing a normal day in my life, I urge you to begin thinking about your stress management skills as well. You can be having headaches, fatigue. Under emotions, you might suddenly not feel confident about your decisions, or you might find that you're angry or more irritable than usual. You tend to be muddled in your thinking and have an inability to make decisions and concentrate. And finally, even things such as being more accident-prone. Might decide that you might need an extra cocktail at night just to get you calmed down from the day. These can all be symptoms of the effects of stress on your body in the rest of your life. So how does stress lead to caregiver burden? I mean, let's face it, if stress is part of our life, why is it different for caregivers? Well, that is true that stress is part of modern day life, but good stress management can offset the damage that it does. However, for family caregivers, they're often in a situation that they are not able to practice good, healthy stress management skills, or they gave up on them due to the time constraints of caregiving. We've talked about how they put their needs last. Preparing a healthy dinner for the family or stopping at the gym on the way home probably has been replaced by fast food takeout and sitting at their loved one's bedside. There are so many decisions to be made, and few people had the chance to prepare for those decisions in advance. This leads to questioning, did I make the right decision? Second guessing, was I the right person to make the decision? Feeling anxious or even guilty for the decisions that they do make. And finally, ask a family caregiver when they last had a good night's sleep, and many of them will just laugh at you because they have long since forgotten what a good night's sleep would be like. An ongoing lack of sleep has dire consequences, but is often overlooked as a cause of the confusion, the anxiety, and the despair that they experience. So why measure caregiver burden? Because caregiver burden without intervention, without those caregivers being led to supports and resources, will eventually end up in caregiver burnout or compassion fatigue. Let's take a look at these terms. Caregiver burden is defined as the perception of stress and fatigue caused by the sustained effort required in caring for persons with chronic illness or other conditions of special needs for care. Now you see I've stressed the word perception there. I will be explaining the reason that's specifically stronger than the other words in that slide later on in the presentation, so stay tuned. Caregiver burnout is defined as caregiver burnout is a state of physical, emotional, and mental exhaustion that may be accompanied by a change in attitude from positive and caring to negative and unconcerned. In the case of caregiver burnout, it's as if the caregiver has lost all will to continue to provide the care. It may begin with mild impatience or forgetting to do some of the nicer things they used to do for their loved one. However, without intervention, the caregiver burnout can become dangerous to the point the caregiver can no longer focus on medication management. They stop caring what their loved one wants and can barely provide the things that are essential to survival. Indeed, caregiver burnout can lead to neglect and abuse. People like to believe that they would never lose their patients or do anything unkind to their loved one. However, physical exhaustion, lack of sleep, depression, and never-ending days of caring for someone would take a toll on anyone. Compassion fatigue. Fatigue, emotional distress, or apathy resulting from the constant demands of caring for others or from constant appeals from charities. Now, as you can see, caregiver burnout and compassion fatigue are very similar, and sometimes they're used interchangeably, and that's why I put both of these definitions in this slide presentation. Usually you'll hear compassion fatigue used more with professional caregivers. Perhaps you've had the experience when you went to a doctor's office and maybe his nursing assistant seemed to be more bothered that you were there than helpful or concerned for your well-being. This could be from compassion fatigue. Most people have known people in the helping profession who are kind and gentle and enthusiastic at the beginning of their careers, but 10, 15 years later, they seem to be angry and bitter towards the very people they were trained to help. This is a very common phenomenon in the helping professions. And also, it's just another expression of caregiver burnout for family caregivers. Now, this pit is a rather graphic example that it is indeed easier to avoid falling into the pit than it is to crawl out of the pit. The thing about caregiver burnout is that it can be avoided. Interventions helping caregivers identify ways to reinstate their self-care activities, such as time with friends and hobbies, is a beginning. Ensuring healthy eating, sleeping, and exercise habits is also part of the recovery process. The sooner these activities are replaced in the caregiver's life, the better chance for avoiding burnout. However, once someone is in the actual state of burnout, the road back is much more difficult because the caregiver has indeed lost the will to do much of anything for their loved one and especially for themselves. I'm sure you will agree by now that caregiver burden is a problem, not just for the family caregiver and their loved one, but for society at large. What would we do if family caregivers just up and said, no more? It would be a sociological disaster. You may be wondering why you don't just take a list of all the duties a caregiver is performing and assign a level of burden based on that. Well, interestingly enough, it's not the amount of work a caregiver has to do that creates the burden. Research shows it is the caregiver's perception of the demands on their time and energy balanced against their perception of their abilities and the resources they have to meet those demands. One caregiver may be in the exact same situation as another caregiver, but the first one may perceive their demands are much greater than their abilities and resources, and that makes them feel extremely burdened and overwhelmed. The other caregiver may look at the demands and say, yes, this is hard, but I have everything I need to handle it. I'm going to be just fine. This is why we'll be asking questions to measure how caregivers perceive their situation. And take a look at this logic model here. This is actually the stress model that was developed as caregiver support programs were being tried in the clinical settings and the clinical trials. As you can see, it starts with some precipitating factor, problems, the disability itself, the condition that is disabling the loved one. Then comes the appraisal of the demands. The caregiver says, now what is this going to take from me? And then they think about what do I have to meet those demands. And it's from that balance between their perceived demands and perceived adaptive capacities that's going to come their perceived stress. From that will come some sort of response, whether it's an emotional response or a behavioral response. Now, whether their responses are healthy, as in, I can do this, I'm going to seek out more resources, I'm going to learn more about this, I'm going to make sure I keep my appointments at the gym, those healthy responses, that's going to enable them to meet those demands and then go back up to the beginning and be ready for the next set of problems that might present themselves. However, if the emotional behavioral response is, I don't see that I'll ever be able to handle this. This is going to be the end of me. I just want to go climb up under my bed. I'm going to have that extra cocktail for dinner. All of those unhealthy responses, that's what's going to get you in trouble and lead to morbidity, indeed even mortality, which is just a fancy way of saying sickness and or death. Now on the right, you'll see how the caregiver support programs can impact that logic model. Caregiver support programs actually impact the perceived stress, and they do that by providing information, by teaching new strategies and tools for positive stress management and problem solving. They give encouragement and hope to the caregivers, and it changes the caregiver's appraisal not only of how overwhelming their situation is, but also their ability to cope with the situation. So identifying caregiver burden is the first step to linking caregivers to the supports they need in order to avoid caregiver burnout. And as I said previously, those caregiver support programs, they impact the caregiver's perception by, first they break their isolation, because caregivers learn that their experiences, they thought, I'm the only person in the world dealing with this. By participating in caregiver support programs, whether it be individualized or group setting, they begin to learn almost immediately that they're having an experience that's shared across the nation with thousands and millions of other caregivers. And as I said, it empowers them with the information and the new skills, and it also links them to resources so that they can expand their network of support, not just for the person they're caring for, but for themselves as well. Now we're going on to the actual assessment tools, but before we do, I know y'all are all old hands in doing assessment, but please bear with me. I just can't help but share these suggestions with you. Points to remember when assessing caregivers is you don't want to guess at their answers. Ask the question and let them answer it. And don't assume you know the answer. Sometimes people will think they know the answer and kind of lead the caregiver with an answer. We don't want to do that. We don't want to guess. We don't want to assume. We don't want to lead. And we want to make sure that we accept only one of the offered responses. If caregivers are notorious for using different wording, and then that would put you in a position of guessing which one of those responses should be selected. So I want you to stop and reread the responses so that they will give you the actual response is part of the instrument. Otherwise, data analysis becomes almost impossible. And finally, when you're assessing a caregiver, I would suggest you remind them that this is not the time to be brave or to minimize how they are feeling. Sometimes family caregivers are concerned that if they let you know how troubled they are or how overwhelmed they feel, you might take action to remove that care recipient from the home. Sometimes they deny the situation they're in because they don't even understand it themselves. They're so busy walking around saying, I'm fine, don't worry about me, worry about my loved one. They're so focused on the needs of their loved one that they haven't even taken time to realize that they indeed are suffering some negative consequences from their caregiving. So this is a time just to help them take a breath and think about their situation so they'll give good, honest, open answers. What we see here is the Zarates screen for Caregiver Burden. This is a 4-question version of the more in-depth Zarates Burden interview. As you'll see, we have gone ahead and circled answers. It's a very simple interview screen. You ask the question, you tell them what their possible responses are, and then you circle the one that they give you. Do you feel that because of your relative that you don't have enough time for yourself? Sometimes. Do you feel stressed because caring for your relative and trying to meet other responsibilities, such as work at home? Nearly always. Now, they're probably going to answer some of these questions. You'll say, do you feel stressed when caring for your relative and trying to meet other responsibilities? All the time. Then you would come back and say, would that be quite frequently or nearly always? That's how you lead them back to the actual responses available. Do you feel strained when you're around your relative? No, not really. Do you mean never or rarely? Sometimes, well, rarely. I say rarely. Do you feel uncertain about what to do about your relative? Sometimes. Then the score, and I apologize, for some reason that's not showing up on our screen here. You simply add up the numbers that are beneath the answers. Sometimes 2, nearly always 4 makes 6, rarely 1 makes 7, sometimes makes 9. So you end up with a score of 9 for this screen. Now for the Zarates screen, the higher the score indicates a higher burden. And a score of 8 or greater will be further assessed using the Bacchus Caregiving Outcome scales. And that's what we're going to talk about next. The Bacchus The Bacchus Caregiving Outcome Scales is really a different kind of burden assessment in that it gives the opportunity to assess what the caregiver, the positive things that the caregiver is getting from their experience as well as the negative things, which is a good tool to be used as people are developing how am I going to work with this caregiver, because oftentimes if you know the strengths, then that's going to help you figure out how to address the weaknesses. There are 16 statements with 3 additional lines for caregivers to provide experiences that were not touched on in the previous statements. Really like this part of the scale because we might be making all sorts of statements, but we still might not hit that thing that the caregiver is most troubled by or gets the most positive feelings out of. So those extra 3 lines are there so that you can capture that information as well. You'll notice that the scale goes from -3 to +3. If the changes in their lives are for the worse, then it's going to be -3, -2, or -1. If their life has not been impacted at all by that statement, then they'll say 0. If they've had a change but it's for the better, it's going to be +1, +2, or +3. So you'll go through all 16 statements. You'll say them out loud, just like this. First when you start, you're going to read the paragraph. Then you're going to start by reading the statements. As a result of providing care, my self-esteem has changed for the worse, -3, -2, -1, did not change, 0, or changed for the best, +1, +2, +3, and give them opportunity to respond. Then move to the next statement. Now we'll talk about how to score the Bacchus Caregiving Outcome Scale. The first step in scoring the BCOS is to convert all the scores to positive numbers. Now, if you'll note on this slide, I have done so by putting the red numbers at the top of each column. But just for sake of further explanation, -3 becomes 1, -2 becomes 2, -1 becomes 3, 0 becomes 4, 1 becomes 5, 2 becomes 6, 3 becomes 7. You might think, why didn't they just use those numbers to begin with? Well, when you're working with a caregiver, you want to emphasize to them that when they're giving us information about how their lives were changed for the worse, and that's a negative number. That's just another way to make sure they understand that here we're giving these 3 numbers that will be how I've been negatively impacted. There I'll be giving 3 numbers where I've been positively impacted. It's a statistical thing. The second thing that you must remember about scoring the BCOS is that we only total the scores from items 1 through 15. 1 through 15. Remember that. 16 through 19 is information that we're gathering that will be useful for people who will be working with that caregiver, but that's not included in the score to indicate their level of burden. Now here I have completed the assessment as well as scored it. So let's just walk through this. I already put the values in the top row so that I'll know for each column what any answer in that column is worth. Then you take the number of items that are circled in each column and multiply it by that assigned value on the top row. So let's start at the left-hand row. There are none in that row, so we'd say 0 times 1 is 0. Enter that score there. For the next row, their value is 2. There are 3 entries in that row. 3 times 2 equals 6. Now in the next row, you'll see there are 4 entries. However, since we don't count anything past 15, the answer in the 16th row will not count. So that means we have 3 in that column to be counted in the score. 3 times 3 equals 9. The next column, it has a value of 4. We have 5 entries there. 5 times 4 is 20. The next has a value of 5 with 1 entry. 1 times 5 is 5. The next column has 0. 0 times 6 is 0. And the last column has 3 entries. 3 times the value of 7 is 21. If you add all of those scores up, you're going to get a total of 61. Again, questions 16 through 19 do not play a role in scoring the Bacchus. If you remember, I told you that a higher score on the Zarates screen indicated higher burden. The opposite is true of the Bacchus Caregiving Outcome Scale. Lower scores indicate higher burden. Just remember that the arrow points down to that poor lady who looks like she's just having a terrible day. So let's review. The Zarates screen for caregiver burden is a 4-item screen. The higher the score indicates greater burden. A score of 8 or greater leads to further assessment using the Caregiver Outcome Scale. The Bacchus Caregiving Outcome Scale identifies strengths as well as challenges. First thing you do is reassign values 1 through 7 across the scale. You use only the first 15 questions to obtain the score. You ask all questions, but you only use the first 15 questions to obtain the score. You multiply the number of items circled in each column by the value assigned to that column, and then you total all columns for the total score. Remember, for the BCOS, the lower score indicates greater burden. I want to thank you for your attention, and most of all, I want to thank you for the work you're doing to help caregivers around the state. by identifying caregivers' levels of burden and linking them to resources that help them avoid falling in that burnout pit. You are doing a great service, not just to that caregiver and that family, but to the entire state of Georgia in supporting our family caregivers. Thank you. Cassandra?
All righty, Gayle. Thank you very much for taking the time to present this information to us today, and I'm certain that all this information will be incredibly useful in future screenings. I'd also like to thank the audience for taking time to join us today to learn more about assessing caregiver burden, and I'd like to remind them at this time to take the post-test that's going to be provided for this webinar. You can find the link to that test below the link that you clicked on to access this video here. Do you have anything else to add right now, Gayle?
No, just like you, I appreciate them taking the time to be with us today.
All righty. Well, once again, thank you, everyone. I'm going to be stopping this recording now, and thank you again.
Goodbye.